with her 9-year-old daughter shivering beside her, and their last $2,800 spent on what appeared to be a crumbling death trap in the Wyoming wilderness. Isabella Rodriguez had unknowingly purchased the key to a century-old conspiracy that would not only save their lives, but expose the truth behind dozens of missing families in Thornfield County. For beneath the rotting floorboards and behind the boarded windows of the abandoned Whispering Pines cabin lay evidence that powerful energy interests had spent generations ensuring would never see daylight. Before we dive into this incredible story, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have an even more extraordinary tale waiting for you. The December wind howled through the towering pines like the voices of the damned as Isabella Rodriguez stood before what had to be the most catastrophic decision of her 34 years. The structure before her could barely be called a cabin. It was more like a wooden carcass left to rot in the merciless Wyoming wilderness. Half the roof had collapsed inward, creating a jagged mouth of broken beams and rusted metal. Windows gaped like hollow eye sockets, boarded up with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bones. The front porch sagged at such an impossible angle that it seemed to defy the laws of physics, held up by what appeared to be nothing more than stubborn determination and decades-old termite damage. "Mommy, this can't be right," whispered 9-year-old Sophia, her breath forming desperate little clouds in the bitter mountain air. Her small hand clutched Isabella's with the fierce grip of a child who had learned too young that safety was never guaranteed. "You said we were going to have a real house again." Isabella's heart shattered into 1,000 pieces as she checked the GPS coordinates on her dying phone for the 4th time. The battery showed 8%, and they were 47 miles from the nearest town. This was it, Lot 23, Whispering Pines Road, Thornfield County, Wyoming. The rustic mountain retreat with tremendous potential from the online government surplus auction that had cost every remaining dollar of their emergency fund. 6 months ago, Isabella had been a project manager at a renewable energy firm in Denver, pulling down a solid 6-figure salary and building what she thought was a secure future for herself and Sophia. She had a corner office, a reliable Toyota Camry, and a modest but comfortable apartment in a good school district. Life wasn't perfect, but it was stable, predictable, safe. Then the corporate restructuring hit like a financial tsunami. Streamlining operations, they called it. Isabella's entire department had been eliminated overnight, replaced by offshore contractors who could do the work for a fraction of the cost. Severance pay had lasted exactly 2 months. Unemployment benefits barely covered rent, let alone Sophia's asthma medications, or the endless stream of bills that kept coming regardless of her employment status. The medical emergency had been the final nail in their financial coffin. Sophia's severe asthma attack in October had required 3 days in the ICU. Even with insurance, the out-of-pocket costs had been staggering. Deductibles, co-pays, prescriptions, follow-up visits, the bills had mounted like an avalanche of bureaucratic cruelty. Isabella had watched their savings evaporate with terrifying speed, each payment bringing them closer to the edge of an abyss she had never imagined they could fall into. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday, 72 hours to vacate. Isabella had called every family member, every friend, every former colleague. Her parents had passed away years earlier. Her sister lived in Puerto Rico with 5 kids of her own and barely enough money to feed them. Friends offered couches for a few nights, but nobody could take in a mother and daughter indefinitely. Homeless shelters in Denver were full, with waiting lists stretching into spring. The family services caseworker had been kind but blunt. If you can't demonstrate stable housing, we may need to consider temporary placement for Sophia while you get back on your feet. The threat of losing her daughter had driven Isabella to desperate measures. She'd sold everything they owned: furniture, electronics, jewelry, even Sophia's beloved collection of books, raising just enough money to keep them in cheap motels while she searched frantically for options. The government surplus auction had appeared in her late-night internet searches like a mirage in the desert. Properties across the western United States, many selling for a fraction of their assessed value. Bank-owned, HUD foreclosures and unclaimed estate properties, the website promised. Your chance to own land and buildings at unbeatable prices. The photos of Lot 23 had been obviously old, probably taken during better years, but they had shown a modest log cabin surrounded by majestic pine trees with snow-capped mountains in the background. Rustic charm meets mountain serenity, the description had read. Perfect for those seeking to escape the hustle and bustle of modern life. Property sold as is, buyer responsible for all inspections and repairs. Isabella had convinced herself it was destiny, a chance to start fresh, away from the crushing expenses of city living. She could work remotely, if she could find work. Sophia could be homeschooled until Isabella figured out the local school situation. They'd be pioneers, modern homesteaders carving out a new life in the wilderness. The bidding had been surprisingly light, only 3 other participants, and none had seemed particularly interested. Isabella had won with a bid of $2,800, exactly the amount she'd raised from selling their possessions. It had felt like a sign from the universe. Now, standing in the gathering twilight with snow beginning to fall, and the temperature dropping toward what the weather app had warned would be a record-breaking low, Isabella realized she might have just signed their death warrant. The harsh reality sets in. "Mommy, I can't feel my toes," Sophia said, her voice small and frightened. Despite her winter coat, scarf, and thick boots, the child was clearly suffering. Her lips had taken on a pale blue tinge that sent panic shooting through Isabella's chest. Isabella forced herself into survival mode. They had 2 sleeping bags rated for temperatures down to 20 degrees. They had canned food, a portable camping stove with 3 fuel canisters, and a small battery-powered heater that might buy them a few hours of warmth. Their car had half a tank of gas, but the nearest town was Hillcrest, 47 miles away, and the mountain roads were already becoming treacherous with ice. More importantly, Isabella had exactly $37 left in her wallet and $17 in her checking account. Even if they could make it back to civilization, they had nowhere to go and no money to get there. They had to make this work, at least for tonight. The front door was secured with a heavy padlock that looked far newer than the rest of the structure, but the wood around the lock hardware was so rotten and water-damaged that Isabella was able to work the screws loose with a quarter from her purse. The lock clattered to the wooden porch, taking a chunk of the doorframe with it. "Stay close to me, Mia," Isabella whispered as they stepped inside. The interior was a monument to decay and abandonment. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, perhaps 600 square feet divided into 3 rooms. The main room featured a massive stone fireplace that dominated one wall, its chimney disappearing into the darkness above. Water stains covered every surface where snow had blown through gaps in the roof and walls. The wooden floor was warped and rotted in several places, with gaping holes that revealed the dark crawl space beneath. The smell hit them immediately, a nauseating combination of mold, rodent droppings, and something else, something organic and deeply unpleasant that suggested they weren't the first living creatures to take shelter here, and that not all of their predecessors had left alive. A small kitchen area in the back corner featured cabinets hanging at drunken angles, and a sink that had apparently been used as a toilet by various forest creatures over the years. The single bedroom was marginally better, though the floorboards there sagged ominously with each step. "I want to go home," Sophia whispered, tears beginning to freeze on her cheeks. Isabella knelt down and pulled her daughter close, fighting back her own tears. "This is home now, sweetheart. I know it doesn't look like much, but we're going to make it beautiful. We're going to make it ours." But even as she spoke the words, Isabella wondered if she was comforting her daughter or trying to convince herself. Outside, the wind was picking up, and she could hear trees creaking ominously in the growing storm. The temperature was supposed to drop to 15 below zero tonight. Their little camping heater and sleeping bags might not be enough. First night struggle setting up their makeshift camp in the main room near the fireplace. Isabella tried to assess their situation rationally. The fireplace appeared functional, though she'd need to clear out years of debris before attempting to use it. More concerning was the fact that they had no firewood and no tools to cut any. The surrounding forest was full of fallen branches, but everything would be wet from snow and previous storms. Their portable camping stove worked well enough to heat a can of soup, which they shared sitting on their sleeping bags with their backs against the stone hearth. Sophia tried to be brave, but Isabella could see the fear in her daughter's eyes. This wasn't an adventure anymore, this was survival. "Tell me the story about the princess and the dragons again," Sophia requested, snuggling deeper into her sleeping bag. Isabella launched into the familiar tale, one she'd been telling since Sophia was tiny, but tonight the story of a brave princess who had to overcome impossible odds to protect her kingdom felt less like fiction and more like prophecy. They were the characters now, trapped in an enchanted castle that was more like a prison, facing challenges that seemed insurmountable. As Sophia finally drifted off to sleep, exhausted by the day's trauma and stress, Isabella sat vigil beside her. The battery-powered heater hummed quietly, pushing out what warmth it could, but the cold seemed to seep through every crack and crevice in the old cabin. She could feel it creeping up from the floorboards beneath them, as if the earth itself was trying to freeze them solid. Around midnight, Isabella heard something that made her blood run cold. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The inciting discovery: Isabella grabbed the camping knife from their supplies, a pathetic weapon, but better than nothing, and crept to one of the boarded windows. Through a gap in the plywood, she could see nothing but darkness and falling snow, but the footsteps continued, methodical and purposeful. Then they stopped. Isabella waited, heart pounding for what felt like hours. Finally she heard the sound of a vehicle starting somewhere in the distance, followed by the crunch of tires on frozen ground. Whoever had been circling their cabin was gone, but why had they been there in the first place? Isabella spent the rest of the night sleepless, keeping watch and trying to make sense of their situation. As dawn broke over the mountain peaks, painting the snow-covered forest in shades of pink and gold, she made a decision. If they were going to survive here, she needed to understand exactly what they'd gotten themselves into. While Sophia slept, Isabella began a systematic exploration of the cabin. In the bedroom, she discovered that several floorboards were loose, apparently damaged by water infiltration over the years. As she tested their stability, one board shifted dramatically, revealing a dark space beneath. Using her phone's flashlight, Isabella peered into the gap. There, wedged between the floor joists, was a metal container about the size of a shoebox. It was wrapped in what appeared to be heavy plastic and oilcloth, carefully sealed against moisture and time. Isabella hesitated. Technically, anything left in the cabin should now belong to her as the new owner, but the deliberate way this container had been hidden suggested it was meant to stay secret. The midnight visitors' circling of the cabin suddenly took on new significance. Had someone been looking for this? Curiosity won over caution. Isabella carefully extracted the container, surprised by its weight. The outer wrappings were secured with duct tape that looked relatively new, certainly not decades old. Someone had been maintaining this hiding spot. Inside the waterproof outer layer was a metal document box with a combination lock, but the lock was open, as if someone had accessed it recently and hadn't bothered to secure it again. The contents made Isabella's hands shake. The first revelation. The documents inside the box painted a picture that transformed their desperate situation into something far more sinister. At the top of the stack was a photocopied newspaper clipping from the Hillcrest County Herald, dated November 15, 1962, mining camp evacuation. Completed, families relocated for safety. Thornfield County, the last residents of the Whispering Pines mining settlement, were successfully relocated yesterday following geological surveys that revealed unstable ground conditions. Blackstone Energy Corporation, which has operated copper and uranium extraction facilities in the area since 1954, cited safety concerns as the primary reason for the evacuation. The welfare of our workers and their families is our top priority, stated Blackstone representative Marcus Donovan. While this decision wasn't made lightly, recent seismic activity and soil composition studies indicated that continued habitation of the settlement posed unacceptable risks. The 43 families affected by the relocation have been provided with transportation and housing assistance to establish new homes in company towns throughout Colorado and Montana. Company spokesman indicated that all families were enthusiastic about the opportunity to relocate to more modern facilities. But beneath this official story lay a collection of documents that told a very different tale. Handwritten letters, apparently never sent, told of families who had been given less than 48 hours to pack their belongings and board buses to unknown destinations. Personal accounts described armed security guards and officials who refused to answer questions about where they were being taken or when they might return. Most disturbing was a letter dated November 12, 1962, written in shaky handwriting. My name is Dr. Samuel Hartwell, and I have served as the medical officer for Whispering Pines Settlement for 8 years. If someone finds this letter, it means that my fears about what Blackstone Energy is planning have come to pass. 3 weeks ago I was asked to examine core samples taken from the deep mines. What I found was not copper or uranium, The samples contained rare earth elements in concentrations I have never seen before: neodymium, dysprosium, terbium, and others. These materials are worth exponentially more than the base metals Blackstone claims to be mining. More concerning are the radiation readings. The levels in some of the deeper shafts are extremely dangerous. Workers have been developing symptoms consistent with radiation poisoning, but Blackstone's management has ordered me to classify these as flu-like illnesses in my reports. Yesterday I overheard a conversation between Blackstone executives and government officials. They were discussing permanent relocation and ensuring no future complications. The tone of the conversation was not about safety. It was about eliminating witnesses. I believe Blackstone intends to remove all the families permanently, not relocate them, disappear them. The mining operation has discovered something worth billions of dollars, and 43 families of miners and their children are the only obstacles to claiming it entirely. I am hiding these documents in the cabin that has served as our community meeting hall, hoping that someday someone will find them and learn the truth. If I disappear along with the others, at least this record will remain. God help us all. Mayor of Dr. Samuel Hartwell, November 12, 1962. Isabella's hands trembled as she read. Sophia stirred in her sleeping bag, making small sounds in her sleep. Outside, the wind had picked up again, howling through the pine trees with a sound that no longer seemed natural, but mournful, like the voices of the lost. Connecting the dots, more documents in the box included geological surveys, maps of the mine shafts, and what appeared to be government correspondence. The official story was that the Whispering Pines settlement had been safely evacuated, and its residents relocated to better living conditions. But Dr. Hartwell's hidden records suggested something far more sinister. According to his documentation, the 43 families, over 150 people, including dozens of children, had been loaded onto buses on November 13, 1962. Official records claimed they were taken to company housing in other states. But Dr. Hartwell had discovered travel documentation that showed the buses had never left Thornfield County. A hand-drawn map showed the route the buses were supposed to have taken, south toward Colorado. But Hartwell had marked a different route in red ink, leading north into the deepest part of the Thornfield National Forest, to an area marked only as Deep Site 7. At the bottom of the document box was a more recent addition, a letter postmarked just 6 months earlier. To whoever finds this record, my name is Margaret Hartwell Chen, and Dr. Samuel Hartwell was my grandfather. He disappeared along with all the other residents of Whispering Pines in November 1962. My family was told he had moved to California for a new medical position, but we never heard from him again. I have spent 30 years researching what happened to the Whispering Pines families. Blackstone Energy Corporation still exists, now called Blackstone Industries, and they continue to operate mining facilities throughout this region. They have grown into one of the largest energy conglomerates in North America. Through Freedom of Information Act requests and private investigation, I have confirmed that the 43 families who disappeared in 1962 were never relocated to company towns. They simply vanished from all records. Social Security Administration has no record of any of them ever working or receiving benefits after November 1962. The children would now be in their 60s and 70s. None have ever applied for driver's licenses, marriage certificates, or any other documentation in any state. I believe my grandfather and the other families were murdered to protect Blackstone's secret discovery. The rare earth elements found in the Whispering Pines mines would have been worth hundreds of millions in 1962 and are worth billions today. I am placing this letter here because I have learned that the original settlement buildings, including this cabin, are being put up for auction by the county. Blackstone has been attempting to acquire this land for decades through various shell companies, but legal complications related to the missing families have prevented clear title transfer. If you have purchased this property, you may be in danger. Blackstone cannot allow evidence of what happened here to surface. I have reason to believe they monitor this area regularly and will take action against anyone who threatens to expose the truth. Please contact me immediately if you find this documentation. We may be able to work together to finally bring justice for the families who disappeared. Margaret Hartwell Chen, phone 307-555-0147, email martwell.research@protonmail.com. P.S. Mind, I have hidden additional evidence in a safe location. If something happens to me, my attorney has instructions to release everything to the media. Isabella stared at the letter, her mind racing. The midnight visitor suddenly made perfect sense. Blackstone Industries had been monitoring this property, waiting to see who might purchase it and what they might discover, and she had just walked into the middle of a 60-year-old mass murder cover-up. The stakes become personal as the reality of their situation sank in. Isabella realized that their problems went far beyond surviving a Wyoming winter. They were now in possession of evidence that could expose one of the largest corporations in America as responsible for the disappearance of over 150 people. Evidence that powerful interests had spent decades ensuring remained buried. The auction had been too easy, she realized now. Only 3 other bidders, none seriously competing. Blackstone had probably arranged for the property to be sold quickly and quietly to someone they could control or intimidate. A desperate single mother with no resources and no connections would be perfect. Someone who could be easily silenced if necessary. Sophia woke up as Isabella was examining the last of the documents. "Mommy, what are you looking at?" "Just some old papers, Maya. Nothing important." Isabella quickly returned the documents to their container. No need to frighten her daughter with the knowledge that they had inadvertently become witnesses to a historical atrocity. But as Isabella prepared their meager breakfast, her mind was working furiously. They couldn't simply ignore what they'd found. Margaret Hartwell Chen was clearly still alive and actively investigating her grandfather's disappearance. The phone number and email address suggested she was serious about finding allies in exposing the truth. More practically, their survival might depend on understanding exactly what they were up against. If Blackstone Industries viewed them as a threat, they needed to know what resources the company had and how far they were willing to go to protect their secrets. Isabella checked her phone. 2% battery remaining, and no signal. She would need to drive toward Hillcrest to find cell coverage, which meant using precious gasoline and leaving their supplies unguarded. But as she looked at her sleeping daughter, still exhausted and cold despite their meager attempts at creating warmth, Isabella knew they had no choice. They needed help, they needed allies, and they needed to understand exactly what they'd stumbled into. The first decision point by mid-morning, Isabella had made her decision. They would drive to Hillcrest, find a place with cell coverage and internet access, and contact Margaret Hartwell Chen. The woman had spent 30 years investigating this mystery. She would know better than anyone how to handle the situation safely. But first, Isabella carefully photographed every document in the container with her phone, uploading them to a cloud storage account. If something happened to the originals, or to them, at least the evidence would survive. She also wrote a detailed email to her sister in Puerto Rico, attaching the photos and explaining their situation, without going into the full conspiracy details. "If you don't hear from me within a week," she wrote, "contact the FBI and give them these documents." As they prepared to leave the cabin, Sophia asked the question Isabella had been dreading. "Are we coming back here tonight, Mommy?" Isabella looked around the rotting, freezing structure that had cost them everything they had left. The smart answer was no. They should drive to Hillcrest, use their last few dollars for a bus ticket back to Denver, and take their chances with social services. Better to risk Sophia being placed in foster care temporarily than to risk both their lives pursuing a decades-old mystery. But as she considered their options, Isabella realized that running away wouldn't solve anything. They still had no money, no job prospects, and no family support. Even if they somehow made it back to Denver, they'd be homeless again within days. And now they carried knowledge that people had been killed to protect. "Yes, Maya," Isabella said finally, "this is our home now, but we're going to make it a real home, warm and safe and beautiful." She wasn't sure if she was lying or making the most important promise of her life. As they drove down the mountain road toward Hillcrest, Isabella caught sight of a black SUV in her rear-view mirror, following at a discreet distance. The same vehicle that had circled their cabin the night before. The game had begun, and Isabella Rodriguez was no longer just a desperate mother trying to survive the winter. She was now a keeper of secrets that powerful people would kill to protect, and the only person standing between her daughter and the same fate that had befallen the 43 families of Whispering Pines settlement. The road ahead disappeared into a tunnel of snow-laden pine trees, and Isabella pressed the accelerator, racing toward an uncertain future, with a determined heart and a borrowed phone battery that would soon die, carrying with it their only connection to the outside world. Behind them, the black SUV maintained its distance, patient as a predator, waiting for the right moment to close the trap that had been 60 years in the making. The winding mountain road to Hillcrest stretched before Isabella like a frozen serpent, its curves disappearing into walls of snow-laden pines that seemed to close in with each passing mile. The Toyota Camry's heater struggled against the bitter Wyoming cold, producing more noise than warmth, while the fuel gauge hovered dangerously close to the quarter-tank mark. In the rear-view mirror, the black SUV maintained its discreet distance, sometimes disappearing around curves only to reappear moments later, a persistent shadow that sent chills down Isabella's spine that had nothing to do with the December weather. "Mommy, why do you keep looking in the mirror?" Sophia asked from her booster seat, her small hands wrapped around a thermos of lukewarm hot chocolate they'd made on the camping stove before leaving the cabin. Isabella forced a smile. "Just checking the road conditions, Maya. The snow makes driving tricky." But the truth was far more sinister. The black SUV had been following them for 23 miles now, maintaining exactly the same distance regardless of Isabella's speed. When she slowed down to navigate icy patches, it slowed down. When she accelerated on straight stretches, it kept pace. Professional surveillance, the kind that suggested resources and experience that a desperate single mother had no hope of evading. The documents hidden in the cabin had changed everything. What had started as a desperate gamble for shelter had transformed into something that could get them both killed. The evidence of Blackstone Industries' involvement in the disappearance of 150 people 60 years ago was damning enough to destroy one of America's largest energy conglomerates. And Isabella was beginning to understand that corporations worth billions of dollars didn't hesitate to eliminate threats to their existence. As they descended toward the valley, where Hillcrest nestled among the foothills, Isabella's phone finally picked up a single bar of signal. The battery showed 1% remaining, enough for maybe one phone call or a few text messages if she was lucky. She pulled into a gas station at the edge of town, ostensibly to fuel up, but really to make contact with the outside world before her phone died completely. The black SUV drove past without stopping, but Isabella caught a glimpse of the driver, a man in his 40s with military short hair and wraparound sunglasses, despite the overcast sky. He didn't look like someone who made mistakes or gave second chances. First contact with Margaret Hartwell Chen, while Sophia used the restroom, and Isabella pumped $20 worth of gas, nearly depleting their remaining cash. She dialed the number from Margaret Hartwell Chen's letter. The phone rang 3 times before a cautious voice answered. "Margaret speaking. Miss Hartwell Chen, my name is Isabella Rodriguez. I found your letter in the Whispering Pines cabin, the one hidden with your grandfather's documents." The silence on the other end stretched so long that Isabella wondered if the call had dropped. Finally, "Are you somewhere safe to talk? I'm at a gas station in Hillcrest, but I think someone's been following us." Dark SUV, tinted windows. Isabella's blood chilled. "Yes, how did you? Because they've been following me for 3 years. Listen carefully. That gas station has security cameras. They'll have footage of your license plate within an hour. You need to get somewhere public immediately. The Hillcrest Diner on Main Street. Order coffee. Sit by the windows. Make yourself visible. They won't try anything in front of witnesses, but you're in serious danger." Isabella's hands shook as she held the dying phone. "What do they want?" "To make sure those documents never see daylight." "How much did you read?" "Everything. The mining camp, the families, the rare earth elements. Then you know what we're dealing with. Blackstone Industries has a 60-year investment in keeping this secret. They've killed to protect it before, and they'll kill again. But if you're brave enough to help me, we might finally be able to expose the truth." The phone battery died mid-conversation, cutting off Margaret's voice and leaving Isabella staring at a black screen that reflected her own terrified face. The Hillcrest Diner revelation. The Hillcrest Diner occupied a corner building on Main Street, its neon sign flickering intermittently in the afternoon gloom. Built in the 1950s, and apparently unchanged since then, it featured red vinyl booths, checkered linoleum floors, and waitresses who looked like they'd been serving coffee since the Eisenhower administration. Isabella chose a booth by the front windows where she could see the street in both directions, ordering coffee for herself and hot chocolate with whipped cream for Sophia. They'd been there less than 10 minutes when a woman in her late 50s approached their table. She had silver-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical ponytail, intelligent brown eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses, and the weathered hands of someone who spent time outdoors. Despite her casual dress, jeans, hiking boots and a down jacket, she moved with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to getting things done. "Isabella Rodriguez?" she asked quietly. Isabella nodded, instinctively pulling Sophia closer to her side. "I'm Margaret Hartwell Chen. I was already on my way here when you called. I've been monitoring police scanners and property records. I knew someone had finally purchased the cabin." She slid into the booth across from them, keeping her voice low. "You and your daughter are in immediate danger. Blackstone has been waiting 60 years for someone to find those documents, and they have protocols in place to handle the situation." Sophia looked up from her hot chocolate with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a friend of Mommy's?" Margaret smiled gently. "I'm going to help your mother with something very important. My grandfather used to live in the mountains near your new cabin, and we're trying to learn more about what happened to him." It was a sanitized version of the truth, but Isabella appreciated Margaret's instinct to protect Sophia from the full horror of their situation. "What kind of protocols?" Isabella asked. Margaret glanced around the diner, noting the other customers, a few local ranchers, an elderly couple sharing pie, a trucker working on paperwork at the counter. No one who looked like corporate security, but that didn't mean they weren't being watched. "Blackstone has a private security division called Thornfield Services. Officially, they provide protection for corporate executives and sensitive facilities. Unofficially, they handle problem resolution for the company. They've been involved in everything from suppressing environmental protests to intimidating whistleblowers. I have evidence that they've been monitoring the Whispering Pines area for decades, waiting for someone to discover what's buried there." Isabella felt sick. "You mean they've been watching that cabin all this time? Motion sensors, trail cameras, probably satellite surveillance. The property auction was a trap. They needed someone to buy the land legally, so they could claim any discoveries were made by trespassers or thieves. A desperate single mother with no resources was perfect. They could discredit you, claim you were making up stories for money, or..." She didn't finish the sentence, but Isabella understood. "Or they could make her disappear the same way they made the 43 families disappear in 1962. The bigger picture emerges. Margaret opened a worn leather briefcase and withdrew a tablet computer. "I've spent 30 years researching this, and you've just provided the final pieces of the puzzle. But to understand what we're really dealing with, you need to see the scope of Blackstone's operations." The tablet screen showed a map of the western United States dotted with colored markers. Red dots indicated current Blackstone mining and energy facilities. Yellow dots marked properties the company had acquired through shell corporations over the past 6 decades. Blue dots showed locations where environmental activists, journalists, or researchers had died or disappeared under suspicious circumstances. The pattern was unmistakable. Blackstone Industries had systematically acquired millions of acres across Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, and Utah, often in areas where local communities had opposed their operations. And those who had opposed them too vigorously had a disturbing tendency to die in car accidents, hiking mishaps, or sudden illnesses. The rare earth elements your grandfather discovered weren't unique to Whispering Pines, Margaret explained, keeping her voice barely above a whisper. Blackstone has been systematically mapping and acquiring deposits across the entire region. With global demand for these materials exploding due to renewable energy technology and electronics manufacturing, their reserves are worth hundreds of billions of dollars. Isabella stared at the map, feeling overwhelmed. But why kill the families? Couldn't they have just bought them out? Because the families would have talked. In 1962, Very few people understood what rare earth elements were, or how valuable they could become. But miners talked to other miners. Word would have spread about unusual materials in the deep shafts. Other companies would have started exploring the region. Property values would have skyrocketed. Margaret zoomed in on the Wyoming section of the map. By eliminating the families and covering up the discovery, Blackstone was able to spend the next 60 years quietly acquiring mineral rights across the entire region for pennies on the dollar. They now control the largest rare earth reserves in North America, maybe the world, and no one has tried to stop them. Many have tried. Some have succeeded in exposing pieces of the truth, but never the full scope. Blackstone has perfected the art of making problems disappear. Journalists die in car accidents. Activists overdose on drugs they've never used. Government regulators retire early to lucrative consulting positions with Blackstone subsidiaries. Sophia had finished her hot chocolate and was coloring on the placemat with crayons provided by the waitress, oblivious to the conversation that was determining her future. Isabella watched her daughter's innocent concentration and felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. "What do you need from me?" Isabella asked. The alliance forms. Margaret's eyes brightened with something that might have been hope. "The documents you found are the smoking gun we've needed for 3 decades. Your grandfather's medical records proving radiation poisoning, the bus route documentation showing the families never left the county, the geological surveys proving Blackstone knew about the rare earth deposits. It's irrefutable evidence of mass murder and conspiracy. But if it's so damning, why hasn't anyone acted on it before?" "Because I've never had the original documents, only photocopies and witness testimony." Blackstone's lawyers could argue that copies were fabricated. "But you now legally own the property where the documents were hidden. You have standing to present them as evidence. More importantly, you have something I've never had." "What's that?" "Legitimacy. I'm the granddaughter of one of the victims, which Blackstone portrays as giving me a biased agenda. You're an innocent purchaser who stumbled across evidence by accident. Your testimony would be much harder for them to discredit." Isabella considered this. "What would we have to do?" Margaret pulled out a detailed plan she'd clearly been developing for years. "First, we document everything. I have a secure facility where we can properly photograph and analyze all the documents, create authenticated copies, and establish a clear chain of custody. Then we approach the FBI simultaneously with multiple field offices, the Department of Justice, and several major news organizations. We make the story too big and too public for Blackstone to suppress. And then we hope the system still works, that there are still people in government and media who care more about truth than corporate profits." Isabella looked out the diner window at the peaceful small-town scene. People going about their normal lives, unaware that one of America's largest corporations was built on mass murder. What happens to Sophia and me during all this? Even if we succeed, Blackstone isn't going to just accept defeat. Margaret's expression grew somber. "I won't lie to you. The next few months will be dangerous. Blackstone will try everything: bribes, threats, character assassination, possibly worse. But I have resources you don't know about yet. Safe houses, legal protection, media contacts. I've been preparing for this moment for 30 years. Why should I trust you?" It was a blunt question, but Margaret nodded approvingly. Because you shouldn't trust anyone completely, including me. But look at your alternatives. You can try to run, but Blackstone has unlimited resources and a 60-year head start. You can try to ignore what you've found, but they'll never believe you'll stay quiet forever. Or you can fight back with someone who knows their tactics and has been planning their downfall for 3 decades. The first test of trust, their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of 2 men in expensive winter coats who entered the diner and took seats at the counter. They ordered coffee, but spent more time watching the mirror behind the counter than drinking it. Isabella recognized one as the driver of the black SUV. Margaret noticed them immediately. "Thornfield Services," she murmured. "They're moving faster than I expected. What do? We finish our coffee like normal people and then leave separately. I'll go first and create a distraction. You wait 5 minutes, then take Sophia and go to the library. It's 4 blocks down Main Street, brick building with white columns. I'll meet you there in 30 minutes. What if they follow us? They will, but the library has multiple exits and good sightlines. More importantly, it has security cameras and public access computers. Everything we do there will be documented." Margaret stood casually and walked to the counter to pay her check. As she did, she accidentally bumped into one of the surveillance men, spilling his coffee across the counter and creating exactly the kind of minor commotion that would give Isabella and Sophia a chance to slip away unnoticed. "So sorry," Margaret exclaimed loudly, drawing the attention of both men and the entire diner staff as she helped clean up the mess. Isabella quickly gathered Sophia and their coats, leaving money on the table and exiting through the rear door that led to the diner's small parking lot. They walked quickly through a residential neighborhood, taking a circuitous route to the library, while Isabella's heart pounded with every step. The Hillcrest Public Library connection. The Hillcrest Public Library was a grand Carnegie-era building that spoke to the town's more prosperous past, when mining and ranching had provided steady employment and optimism about the future. Now it served a dwindling population with reduced hours and an elderly librarian who seemed genuinely pleased to see new faces. "Welcome to Hillcrest," she beamed as Isabella and Sophia entered. "I'm Mrs. Patterson. Are you visiting or new to the area?" "We just moved here," Isabella replied, which was technically true. "My daughter loves to read, and I need to use a computer to check email." "Wonderful. The children's section is over there, and the public computers are along the far wall. Let me know if you need help with anything."
Oh, Sophia browsed picture books.
Isabella logged into a public computer and began researching everything she could find about Blackstone Industries and the disappearances at Whispering Pines. What she discovered made her stomach turn. The official story about the 1962 relocation had been meticulously maintained for 60 years. Government records showed that 43 families had been successfully moved to company housing in Colorado, Montana, and Idaho. Social Security Administration files indicated that the adults had continued working for Blackstone subsidiaries until retirement, with death certificates filed appropriately over the decades. But Margaret had been right, it was all fabricated. Birth certificates for children who should have reached adulthood showed no subsequent records. Marriage licenses, driver's licenses, voter registrations, none of the documentation that real people generated throughout their lives. The 43 families had become bureaucratic ghosts, existing only in carefully maintained corporate records. More disturbing was what Isabella found about recent opposition to Blackstone operations. Environmental journalist Sarah Kim had died in a car accident in 2019 while investigating groundwater contamination near a Blackstone facility in Utah. Geologist Dr. Robert Chen had suffered a fatal heart attack in 2020 after publishing a paper questioning the environmental impact assessments for Blackstone's Colorado operations. Activist Maria Santos had overdosed on fentanyl in 2021, despite having no history of drug use and being in the middle of organizing protests against a proposed Blackstone mining expansion in Montana. The pattern was clear to anyone looking for it, but each individual case could be explained as coincidence. Heart attacks happened, car accidents occurred, drug overdoses were sadly common. Only when viewed together did the systematic elimination of Blackstone's opponents become obvious. Margaret's arrival, and the plan. Margaret arrived at the library exactly 30 minutes later, entering through a side door and making her way to Isabella's computer terminal without appearing to rush. She glanced at the screen and nodded grimly. "You're beginning to understand what we're dealing with," she said quietly, taking the adjacent computer. "Blackstone doesn't just eliminate threats, they perfect the art of making elimination look natural. How have you survived 30 years of investigating them? By being very careful, very smart and very patient. Also by building a network of people who share information and watch each other's backs. You're not the first person to discover evidence of Blackstone's crimes, just the first with documents strong enough to prove them." Margaret opened a secure email account and began typing rapidly. "I'm alerting my contacts that we're moving to the next phase. FBI agents I trust, journalists with investigative experience, lawyers who specialize in corporate crime. By tomorrow morning, dozens of people will know about the Whispering Pines documents. Won't that make us bigger targets? Yes and no. Blackstone prefers to eliminate threats quietly, before they can spread information. Once knowledge is widespread, elimination becomes counterproductive. It just confirms that the information was true. But they'll certainly try other methods of stopping us." Isabella was about to ask what other methods when Mrs. Patterson approached their computer area with a concerned expression. "Excuse me, but there are some men outside asking about you," she told Isabella quietly. "They showed me badges and said they were federal agents investigating tax evasion. They wanted to know if you'd used our computers to access financial accounts." Margaret and Isabella exchanged glances. Real federal agents wouldn't approach a librarian with questions about tax investigations. Blackstone was escalating their tactics. "Thank you for letting us know," Margaret said calmly. "Did they say what agency they were with?" "IRS Criminal Investigation, I think. But, Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice further. "I've lived in this town for 70 years, and I know what federal agents look like. These men seemed more like the corporate security types who sometimes come through when there's trouble at the mining facilities." Isabella felt a chill of recognition. Mrs. Patterson had lived through the Whispering Pines era. She might have been a child in 1962, but she would remember the sudden disappearance of families from the mountain settlements. "Mrs. Patterson," Margaret said carefully, "do you remember the mining camp evacuations in the early 1960s? The elderly librarian's face changed, aging decades in an instant. "You're not really new to town, are you? You'll hear about what happened to those families. You knew them." My brother Danny was best friends with Tommy Hartwell. That was your grandfather's family, wasn't it? Mrs. Patterson looked at Margaret with sudden recognition. You have his eyes. Margaret nodded. I've been trying to find out what really happened to them. Mrs. Patterson glanced around the library, ensuring they were alone, then spoke in barely a whisper. Everyone in town knew something was wrong. The evacuation happened too fast, too quietly, and none of those families ever wrote letters or made phone calls afterward. In a community like this, people stay in touch, but it was like they just vanished. Did anyone try to investigate? Sheriff Morrison asked questions, but he was told it was a federal matter. Then he died in a hunting accident 2 weeks later. New sheriff got the message real clear. Don't ask questions about Blackstone operations. Isabella realized they were dealing with a conspiracy that had corrupted local law enforcement for generations. Mrs. Patterson, the men outside, are they still there? The librarian peered through the front windows. I see their car, but I don't see them. They might be watching the building. Margaret made a decision. Is there a back exit? Through the basement. It connects to the old coal tunnels that run under downtown. You can come out 3 blocks away at the old Methodist church. As they gathered their things, Mrs. Patterson handed Margaret a small key. This opens the Historical Society's archives in the church basement. Danny kept records about the mining camps. He became obsessed with documenting what happened after Tommy disappeared. Everything he collected is in there. The underground escape. The library's basement was a maze of storage rooms and forgotten archives, but Mrs. Patterson led them confidently to a heavy wooden door marked authorized personnel only. Beyond it lay a tunnel carved from native stone, wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and tall enough that even adults could stand upright. These tunnels were built in the 1890s to transport coal from the mines to the railroad depot. Mrs. Patterson explained as they walked through the darkness, guided by Margaret's flashlight app. During Prohibition, they were used to smuggle liquor. Now they're mostly forgotten, except by old-timers like me. The tunnel network was more extensive than Isabella had imagined, with branches leading in multiple directions beneath the town. Some passages showed signs of recent use. Footprints in the dust, modern graffiti on the walls, suggesting that local teenagers had discovered at least some of the entrances. They emerged 20 minutes later, in the basement of the abandoned Methodist church, a Gothic structure that had been built during Hillcrest's mining boom and gradually fallen into disrepair as the town's population declined. The basement was dry and surprisingly well preserved, with rooms that had clearly been used for community meetings and storage over the decades. Margaret used Mrs. Patterson's key to open a locked room marked Historical Society Archives. Inside were filing cabinets, boxes of documents, and walls covered with photographs spanning the town's entire history. But one section had been set aside specifically for documentation related to the mining camp disappearances. Danny Patterson had been 12 years old when his best friend Tommy Hartwell disappeared along with the other Whispering Pines families. According to the materials in the archive, he had spent the rest of his life trying to understand what had happened to them. The collection was staggering in its scope and obsessive detail. Danny had interviewed everyone in Hillcrest who remembered the evacuations, collecting oral histories that contradicted the official story at every point. He had obtained geological surveys, mining permits and corporate filings through Freedom of Information Act requests decades before such research became common. Most importantly, he had documented a pattern of similar disappearances at other Blackstone facilities across the western United States. "My God," Margaret whispered as she examined Danny's research. "I thought Whispering Pines was an isolated incident. But look at this." She had found a map similar to the one on her tablet, but far more detailed and spanning a longer time frame. Red pins marked locations where entire communities had been relocated by Blackstone between 1954 and 1979. Blue pins indicated individual activists, journalists or researchers who had died under suspicious circumstances while investigating Blackstone operations. Yellow pins showed facilities where environmental or safety incidents had been covered up through corporate influence. The pattern revealed a systematic campaign of elimination that had lasted for decades. Blackstone hadn't just killed the Whispering Pines families, they had refined mass murder into a corporate strategy. "There are over 300 pins on this map," Isabella said. "Feeling sick. 300 that Danny could document," Margaret corrected. "Probably thousands more that were covered up so effectively that no records survived." Isabella thought about Sophia, playing innocently in the children's section of the library, while her mother discovered evidence of corporate genocide. How many people know about this? Based on Danny's notes, maybe a dozen researchers nationwide have pieces of the puzzle, but they've never coordinated their efforts, and Blackstone has been very effective at isolating and eliminating individual investigators. Margaret photographed Danny's entire collection with a high-resolution camera, working with the efficient speed of someone who had done this many times before. "This changes everything. With Danny's research combined with your grandfather's documents, we have evidence of a 60-year conspiracy involving hundreds of murders and billions of dollars in theft. But we also have proof that Blackstone has successfully eliminated threats for decades," Isabella pointed out. "What makes you think we'll be any different? Because this time we're not working alone." The network reveals itself as if summoned by Margaret's words. The archive room door opened and 3 people entered. Isabella instinctively moved to protect Sophia, but Margaret raised a calming hand. "It's okay. These are my colleagues." The first was a woman in her 40s with short gray hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. She introduced herself as Dr. Elena Vasquez, a forensic accountant who had been tracking Blackstone's financial irregularities for 15 years. The second was a tall black man with prematurely white hair who moved with the careful precision of law enforcement. "Agent James Wright, FBI Financial Crimes Division," he said quietly. "Retired but still licensed and still pissed off about the cases they wouldn't let me pursue." The third was younger, maybe 30, with the nervous energy of someone who spent their time looking over their shoulder. "Kelly Morrison," she said. "Investigative journalist. My grandfather was the sheriff who died asking questions about the first disappearances." Margaret gestured to the wall of evidence surrounding them. "Isabella, meet the core of what we call the Whispering Pines Network. We've been gathering evidence and protecting each other for years, waiting for the proof we needed to bring Blackstone down." Vasquez opened a laptop and began connecting it to a portable scanner. "We need to digitize everything immediately. Danny's collection, your grandfather's documents, everything. Once it's uploaded to our secure servers with multiple backups, Blackstone can't destroy the evidence by eliminating us." Agent Wright was examining Danny's map with professional interest. "This level of systematic elimination suggests coordination at the highest levels of government. FBI, state police, local law enforcement. Someone has been protecting Blackstone for decades. Kelly Morrison was already typing on her phone. I'm alerting our media contacts. By morning, 6 different news organizations will have copies of everything. Blackstone's usual tactics won't work when the story breaks simultaneously across multiple platforms. Isabella felt overwhelmed by the sudden expansion of their situation. How long have you been planning this? Since the day they killed my grandfather, Margaret replied. But we've been waiting for the right moment, the right evidence, the right circumstances. Your discovery of the original documents was the final piece we needed. As the team worked with practiced efficiency to document and preserve everything they'd found, Isabella realized that she and Sophia had become central figures in a battle that had been brewing for 3 generations. The abandoned cabin she'd purchased in desperation had connected them to a network of people who had dedicated their lives to exposing one of the most monstrous corporate conspiracies in American history. But as she watched Sophia play quietly in the corner, oblivious to the magnitude of what was unfolding around her, Isabella wondered if seeking justice was worth the risks they were about to face. Blackstone Industries had killed hundreds of people to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to add a single mother and her daughter to that list. The question was no longer whether they could expose the truth, but whether they could survive long enough to see justice done. Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching made everyone in the room freeze. Margaret checked her phone and cursed softly. Motion sensors around the church just activated, she said. Multiple vehicles approaching from different directions. Agent Wright drew a service weapon that Isabella hadn't realized he was carrying. How long do we need to finish here? Dr. Vasquez was frantically scanning documents. 10 more minutes to get everything essential. We might not have 10 minutes, Kelly Morrison said, peering through a basement window. I count at least 6 men with tactical gear. This isn't surveillance anymore. It's a tactical operation. Margaret made a decision that would determine all their fates. Elena, pack up what you can. James, how many exits does this building have? 3, but they'll have them all covered by now. Then we use the tunnels again. Isabella, get Sophia ready to move. This is where the real fight begins. As they prepared for what might be their final escape, Isabella realized that her desperate gamble for shelter had escalated into a war against one of the most powerful corporations in America. And somewhere in the darkness above them, professional killers were preparing to ensure that the truth about Whispering Pines would die with everyone who had discovered it. The battle for justice was about to begin, with a single mother and her daughter at the center of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of American power and influence. The ancient coal tunnels beneath Hillcrest stretched like arteries through the mountain town's underground anatomy, connecting buildings that had been constructed during the mining boom of the 1890s. Margaret led their desperate group through passages that seemed to twist and branch with no discernible pattern, their footsteps echoing hollowly in the darkness broken only by the harsh glare of LED flashlights. Isabella carried Sophia piggyback style through the narrow confines, feeling her daughter's arms wrapped tightly around her neck and her small body trembling with a mixture of cold and fear. The 9-year-old had remained remarkably composed throughout their escape from the church basement, but Isabella could sense the questions building behind her daughter's wide, observant eyes. "Where are we going, Mummy?" Sophia whispered, her breath warm against Isabella's ear. "Somewhere safe, Misha," Isabella replied, though she was beginning to wonder if such a place still existed in a world where one of America's largest corporations would deploy tactical teams to silence a single mother and her child. Behind them, Agent Wright moved with the controlled alertness of someone accustomed to hostile environments, his service weapon drawn and ready despite the apparent emptiness of the tunnels. Dr. Vasquez carried a backpack loaded with hard drives and documents, the digital preservation of 60 years of evidence that could topple an empire. Kelly Morrison brought up the rear, typing constantly on her phone as she coordinated with media contacts and prepared to unleash a story that would shake the foundations of American corporate power. Margaret paused at a junction where 4 tunnels converged, consulting a hand-drawn map that looked like it had been sketched decades earlier. Danny Patterson documented these tunnels extensively, she explained in a low voice. After his friend disappeared, he became convinced that the underground passages were the key to understanding how Blackstone had moved people without being seen. "You mean the families were brought down here?" Isabella asked, feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the underground temperature. Danny found evidence that buses had been driven into the old coal processing facility on the outskirts of town. The facility connected to the main tunnel system through a passage that was sealed in the 1970s. He believed the families were brought underground and moved to other locations. Agent Wright examined the walls more closely with his flashlight. These tunnels would be perfect for transporting large numbers of people without detection. No witnesses, no traffic cameras, no paper trail. The implications were horrifying. The 43 families of Whispering Pines hadn't just been murdered, they had been systematically processed through an underground transportation network that allowed their killers to operate with complete impunity. How many people in town knew about these tunnels? Kelly Morrison asked, pausing in her urgent typing. Everyone who grew up here knew they existed. Margaret replied, but most people assumed they were just abandoned mining infrastructure. Danny was the only one who understood their true purpose. As they continued deeper into the tunnel system, Isabella began to notice disturbing details that suggested the passages had been used for purposes far beyond coal transportation. Modern electrical cables ran along the ceiling in some sections. Air vents had been installed to provide circulation. Metal fixtures indicated that lighting systems had once illuminated these underground corridors. Someone had invested significant resources in maintaining and upgrading the tunnel network long after the coal mines had closed. The underground facility, their journey through the labyrinthine passages ended at a heavy steel door marked with radiation warning symbols and biohazard notices. Margaret produced an electronic key card from her jacket pocket, explaining quietly that Danny Patterson had spent years infiltrating Blackstone's security systems before his death in what officials had ruled a tragic hiking accident. Danny discovered that Blackstone never abandoned their Hillcrest operations, Margaret said as the electronic lock disengaged with a soft click. They just moved them underground. Beyond the door lay a modern facility that seemed impossible given their location beneath a decaying mountain town. Fluorescent lighting illuminated corridors lined with scientific equipment, computer workstations, and monitoring devices that hummed with electronic activity. The air was climate-controlled and filtered, carrying the antiseptic smell of a high-tech laboratory. "What is this place?" Dr. Vasquez asked, her forensic accountant's mind clearly working to understand the financial implications of such an installation. Margaret led them through the facility, pointing out various sections with the familiarity of someone who had studied the layout extensively. "This is Blackstone's real research center. Officially they conduct geological surveys and environmental monitoring here. Unofficially, they've been developing technologies to extract rare earth elements from previously inaccessible deposits." They passed laboratories filled with equipment. Isabella didn't recognize massive centrifuges, spectrographic analyzers, and computer systems that appeared to be modeling complex chemical processes. Wall-mounted displays showed real-time data from mining operations across the western United States, with production figures that dwarfed Blackstone's publicly reported output. They're producing 10 times more rare earth elements than their SEC filings indicate, Dr. Vasquez observed, photographing the displays with professional interest. The financial implications are staggering. We're talking about billions of dollars in unreported revenue. Agent Wright was examining security protocols posted throughout the facility. This operation requires federal permits for radiation handling, environmental monitoring, and hazardous material storage. Someone in Washington is covering for them at the highest levels, but it was Kelly Morrison who made the most disturbing discovery. In a section labeled Historical Research, she found filing cabinets containing detailed records of every family that had disappeared from Blackstone facilities over the past 70 years. Not just the 43 families from Whispering Pines, but hundreds of others from mining communities across the American West. They kept records, she said in disbelief, names, ages, dates of elimination, disposal methods, everything. It's like they were proud of their efficiency. Isabella set Sophia down near a computer workstation, where her daughter could rest while the adults examined the horrifying documentation. The files revealed a level of systematic planning that transformed mass murder into an industrial process. Blackstone had developed protocols for identifying potential threats, isolating communities, and eliminating entire populations, while maintaining plausible cover stories for government investigators. The Whispering Pines incident hadn't been an isolated atrocity. It was merely the first implementation of a systematic approach to corporate genocide that had been refined and repeated hundreds of times over 7 decades.
As the team worked to document and photograph the underground facility's contents, the true scope of Blackstone's operations became clear. The company hadn't just covered up individual crimes, they had created an entire parallel infrastructure for conducting and concealing systematic atrocities. Dr. Vasquez discovered financial records indicating that Blackstone had been operating a network of underground facilities across the western United States since the 1950s. Each facility was officially described as a geological research station or environmental monitoring center, but the actual operations involved extracting rare earth elements using techniques that would have been environmentally catastrophic if conducted above ground. They've been strip mining the entire region from underground, she explained as she scrolled through production data. Extracting resources without environmental oversight, without community consultation, without any of the regulatory controls that govern surface mining operations. Agent Wright had found personnel files that revealed the existence of a private security force larger than many state police departments. Thornfield Services wasn't just corporate security. It was a paramilitary organization with resources and authorization that suggested government cooperation at the highest levels. Look at these personnel classifications, he said, pointing to organizational charts that showed hundreds of employees in categories like Resource Acquisition Specialist and Community Relations Manager. These are euphemisms for kidnappers and assassins. Blackstone has been operating a private army for 70 years. Kelly Morrison was documenting communication records that showed coordination between Blackstone executives and officials in multiple federal agencies. FBI directors, EPA administrators, Interior Department secretaries, all had been briefed on Blackstone's special operations and had provided assistance in maintaining operational security. "This goes all the way to the top," she said grimly. "Multiple presidential administrations have known about this and provided cover. We're not just dealing with corporate crime, we're talking about government-sanctioned genocide." Isabella felt overwhelmed by the magnitude of what they were discovering. She had thought they were investigating a decades-old mining accident, but instead they had uncovered evidence of the largest systematic atrocity in American history. Thousands of families had been eliminated to protect corporate profits, and the highest levels of government had been complicit in covering up the crimes. "How do we fight something this big?" she asked, voicing the question that all of them were considering. The strategic response: Margaret had been working at a secure computer terminal, uploading everything they had documented to multiple servers around the world. "We don't fight it," she said finally. "We expose it. Once this information becomes public, they can't suppress it without confirming its accuracy." Her strategy was elegant in its simplicity. Rather than trying to prosecute Blackstone through a judicial system that had been compromised for decades, they would release everything simultaneously through multiple channels, creating a media firestorm that would force government action. "I have contacts at the Washington Post, the New York Times, the Guardian, Der Spiegel, and Le Monde," Kelly Morrison explained. "All have investigative teams that specialize in corporate crime and government corruption. If we can get the story published simultaneously in multiple countries, it becomes impossible to suppress." Dr. Vasquez was preparing financial documentation that would trigger automatic investigations by the Securities and Exchange Commission, the Internal Revenue Service, and international banking authorities. Once they see evidence of billions in unreported revenue, they'll freeze Blackstone's assets pending investigation. Even if they try to suppress the criminal evidence, they can't ignore financial fraud on this scale. Agent Wright was coordinating with former colleagues in law enforcement who had been frustrated by restrictions on investigating Blackstone operations. There are honest agents in every major law enforcement agency who have been waiting for an opportunity to pursue these cases. Once the evidence becomes public, they'll have the political cover they need to act. But even as they prepared their coordinated assault on Blackstone's conspiracy, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that they were underestimating their opponents. A corporation that had successfully concealed systematic genocide for 70 years wouldn't be easily defeated by media exposure and financial investigations. "What happens to us after we release this information?" she asked. "Blackstone will know we were responsible." Margaret's expression grew somber. "They'll try to discredit us first, claim we're mentally unstable, financially motivated, or part of some foreign conspiracy. When that doesn't work, they'll escalate to physical threats. Eventually, if we remain effective, they'll try to eliminate us. Then why are we doing this?" "Because someone has to," Kelly Morrison replied simply. "My grandfather died trying to expose the truth about the first disappearances. Danny Patterson spent his life documenting their crimes. Your grandfather preserved evidence for 60 years hoping someone would find it. We're not just fighting for justice, we're honoring the courage of everyone who came before us." Sophia's uncomfortable questions, while the adults had been absorbed in their discoveries, Sophia had been quietly observing everything around her, with the sharp intelligence that had always impressed Isabella. Now, as they prepared to leave the underground facility, her daughter finally voiced the questions that had been building throughout their ordeal. "Mommy, are we in trouble with the police?" Isabella knelt down to meet her daughter's eyes. "No, Mia. We're trying to help the police understand something important that happened a long time ago. Are the bad men going to hurt us?" The directness of the question took Isabella's breath away. Sophia had clearly understood more about their situation than Isabella had realized. "I'm going to do everything I can to keep you safe. But you're scared." It wasn't a question, and Isabella couldn't bring herself to lie. "Yes, I'm scared, but sometimes grown-ups have to do scary things, because they're the right things to do." Margaret had been listening to their conversation, and approached with a gentleness that contrasted sharply with her usual professional demeanor. "Sophia, do you remember the story your mother tells you about the princess and the dragons?" Sophia nodded solemnly. "Well, sometimes real life has dragons too. They're not the same as the ones in stories, but they're just as dangerous. And sometimes regular people have to be brave like the princess and fight the dragons so that other people can be safe." "Are you fighting dragons?" "We're trying to, and your mother is helping us, which makes her very brave." Isabella felt tears stinging her eyes as she realized that her 9-year-old daughter was being forced to confront moral complexities that most adults never faced. But Sophia surprised her with the resilience that children often demonstrated in impossible circumstances. "I want to help fight the dragons too," Sophia said firmly. "You are helping," Margaret assured her. "By being brave and staying close to your mother, you're helping more than you know." The escape plan. Their time in the underground facility was running out. Margaret's security monitoring indicated that Blackstone tactical teams were conducting systematic searches of every building in Hillcrest, and it was only a matter of time before they discovered the tunnel entrances. "We need to split up," Agent Wright decided. "Traveling together makes us too visible and too vulnerable. If they capture all of us, the evidence dies with us." The plan they developed was risky but logical. Dr. Vasquez would take the financial evidence and travel to Washington, D.C., where she had contacts in multiple federal agencies. Agent Wright would return to his former FBI colleagues with the criminal evidence, using his personal relationships to ensure it reached investigators who couldn't be compromised. Kelly Morrison would coordinate the media release from a secure location, timing the publication to maximize impact and minimize Blackstone's ability to suppress the stories. Margaret would continue uploading evidence to secure servers around the world, creating redundant backups that would ensure the information survived even if they didn't. Isabella and Sophia would be taken to a safe house where they could remain hidden while the initial storm of publicity played out. Once the evidence became public and Blackstone's attention was focused on damage control, they would be relocated permanently with new identities if necessary. "What about the cabin?" Isabella asked. "All our belongings are still there. Blackstone probably has it under surveillance by now," Margaret replied. "You can't go back there. Consider everything you left behind as lost." The finality of that statement hit Isabella hard. The cabin had been their only asset, their desperate gamble for a new life. Now it was just another piece of evidence in a case that had consumed their future along with their past. The Underground Railroad. Their escape from the facility began through a different set of tunnels that connected to the old railroad depot on the outskirts of Hillcrest. Margaret explained that the tunnel system had been designed to move coal from the mines to the rail lines, but during the height of Blackstone's elimination campaigns, it had served a darker purpose. Danny Patterson believed that some of the families weren't killed immediately, she said, as they navigated narrow passages lit only by their flashlights. His research suggested that Blackstone used the tunnels to transport people to remote facilities where they were held before being eliminated. The thought of families being marched through these dark corridors toward their deaths made Isabella pull Sophia closer to her side. How many children had walked these same paths, not understanding that they would never see daylight again? They emerged from the tunnel system in the basement of the abandoned railroad depot, a massive Victorian structure that had once been the economic heart of Hillcrest. The building was officially condemned, but Margaret had been using it as a staging area for her investigation activities. In a hidden room behind the old station master's office, she had assembled what amounted to a war room dedicated to bringing down Blackstone Industries. Maps covered every wall, showing the locations of Blackstone facilities, documented disappearances, and suspected mass burial sites. Computer equipment hummed quietly as it maintained secure communications with a network of investigators, journalists and activists around the world. "This is where we've been planning their downfall for the past 5 years," Margaret explained as she began activating various systems. "Every piece of evidence, every connection, every vulnerability, we've been building toward this moment." Dr. Vasquez was already at work uploading financial evidence to secure servers, her forensic accountant's expertise evident in the speed and precision with which she organized complex data. "The SEC will have to investigate once they see this," she said confidently. "Even if they want to protect Blackstone, the financial irregularities are too blatant to ignore." Agent Wright was using encrypted communications to contact former colleagues in law enforcement, men and women he trusted to act on evidence regardless of political pressure. "I'm sending everything to agents in 6 different field offices simultaneously," he reported. "Even if Blackstone has people in the bureau, they can't control every office." Kelly Morrison was coordinating with international media contacts, preparing a coordinated release that would make the story impossible to suppress. The Guardian and Der Spiegel are already reviewing preliminary materials, she said as she worked. They'll publish within hours of receiving the complete documentation.
As the team made their final preparations, Isabella realized that their discovery in the abandoned cabin had triggered a sequence of events that would determine not just their own survival, but the fate of one of the most powerful corporations in America. The evidence they had uncovered would either bring justice for thousands of victims or result in their own elimination as threats to Blackstone's continued existence. Margaret approached Isabella with a secure satellite phone and a packet of documents. "This contains everything you need to reach our safe house network," she explained. "Phone numbers, code words, emergency procedures. If something happens to the rest of us, you'll still be able to get protection for yourself and Sophia. What happens if we succeed in exposing them? Then you and Sophia will be famous as the people who brought down one of the largest corporate conspiracies in history. You'll have book deals, movie rights, and enough money to live comfortably for the rest of your lives. And if we fail," Margaret's expression was grim, "then you'll disappear like all the others, and Blackstone will continue operating for another 70 years. Isabella looked at her daughter, who was sleeping peacefully on a cot in the corner of the war room,
exhausted by their day of underground travel and adult concerns she couldn't fully understand. Sophia trusted her mother to make the right decisions, to keep her safe, to fight the dragons that threatened their world. But Isabella was beginning to understand that some dragons were too large and too powerful to be defeated by individuals, no matter how brave or determined they might be. Blackstone Industries had resources that dwarfed the combined efforts of their small group. They had government connections, unlimited financial resources, and 70 years of experience in eliminating threats. The only advantage Isabella and her allies possessed was the truth. And in a world where truth had become a commodity to be bought, sold, or suppressed, even that might not be enough. The first strike they're planning was interrupted by an urgent alert from Margaret's security systems. Motion detectors throughout Hillcrest were triggering in sequence, indicating a coordinated search pattern that was moving systematically through the town. They found the tunnel entrances, Agent Wright reported, monitoring communications on a police scanner. Tactical teams are deploying into the underground system. Margaret began rapidly shutting down equipment and destroying any evidence of their presence. We have maybe 10 minutes before they reach this location. Everyone needs to be ready to move immediately. The escape vehicles were positioned behind the railroad depot, a van for Margaret and the digital evidence, a sedan for Dr. Vasquez and the financial documentation, and a pickup truck for Agent Wright and the criminal evidence. Isabella and Sophia would travel with Kelly Morrison in a nondescript SUV toward the first safe house. But as they prepared to leave, Sophia woke up and asked the question that would haunt Isabella for the rest of her life. "Mommy, what happens to all the families who disappeared? Don't they have children and grandchildren who are still waiting for them to come home?" The innocent question struck at the heart of why they were risking everything. This wasn't just about exposing corporate crime or seeking justice for historical atrocities. It was about providing answers to thousands of people who had spent their lives wondering what had happened to their missing relatives. Isabella knelt down and pulled her daughter close. "That's exactly why we have to be brave, Mia, so that all those families can finally know the truth." As they prepared to begin their desperate race against time and corporate power, Isabella realized that her daughter had understood something that even the adults had missed. This wasn't just about fighting dragons. It was about bringing peace to the families of all the victims who had been lost in the darkness of Blackstone's underground kingdom. The war for truth was about to begin, and everything they had discovered was about to be tested against the full power of an empire built on 70 years of systematic murder and concealment. Win or lose, nothing would ever be the same again. Outside, the sound of vehicles approaching told them that Blackstone had found their location. The final phase of their desperate gamble was about to begin, with the lives of a single mother and her 9-year-old daughter hanging in the balance, along with the fate of thousands of victims who had been waiting 60 years for justice. The tunnels that had once hidden genocide would now either facilitate their escape or become their tomb. And somewhere in the darkness above, professional killers were preparing to ensure that the truth about Whispering Pines would die with everyone who had discovered it. The tactical teams reached the railroad depot just as Isabella and Sophia climbed into Kelly Morrison's SUV. Through the rear window, Isabella watched Margaret's war room explode in flames, a pre-programmed destruction sequence that would eliminate any evidence of their planning, while buying precious minutes for their escape. "Hold on," Kelly said grimly, as she accelerated toward the mountain highway. Behind them, the abandoned depot erupted in a coordinated series of explosions that lit up the night sky, ensuring that Blackstone would find nothing but ash and twisted metal. The next 6 hours became a desperate race across 3 states as the team executed their coordinated plan, while Blackstone's resources mobilized to stop them. Dr. Vasquez reached Washington, D.C., and delivered financial evidence to the SEC before disappearing into witness protection. Agent Wright's law enforcement contacts initiated simultaneous investigations in 6 FBI field offices, creating too many fronts for Blackstone to suppress. But it was Kelly Morrison who delivered the killing blow. As dawn broke over the Rocky Mountains, she released the complete story simultaneously through the Washington Post, The Guardian, Der Spiegel, and 12 other international publications. The headline that appeared on front pages around the world was devastating in its simplicity: American energy giant linked to systematic murder of thousands over 7 decades. The evidence was overwhelming. Blackstone's own records documented the elimination of 347 families across the western United States. Government communications proved complicity at the highest levels. Financial records revealed billions in unreported revenue from illegal mining operations. Most damning of all were the photographs of mass burial sites that Margaret's network had been documenting for years. Within hours, Blackstone's stock price collapsed. Trading was suspended as investors fled. FBI raids began simultaneously at 17 facilities across 6 states. International banking authorities froze corporate assets pending investigation. But Blackstone's final gambit was personal. They located Isabella and Sophia at the safe house outside Denver and made one last offer through an intermediary: $10 million and guaranteed safety in exchange for a public statement claiming the documents were fabricated. Isabella's response was delivered through Kelly Morrison's live television interview that evening: "Some things can't be bought. Justice for those families isn't for sale." Epilogue. 6 months later, the Whispering Pines cabin looked different in the summer sunlight. Its rotting timbers replaced with fresh lumber, its broken windows gleaming with new glass. Isabella and Sophia had used the reward money from the FBI, $2 million for information leading to the conviction of corporate executives, to restore not just their cabin but the entire abandoned settlement. Sophia ran through the wildflower meadow where the old mining camp had once stood, her laughter echoing off the mountain peaks. She was healthy, happy, and remarkably resilient after their ordeal. The dragons had been defeated, and the princess had won. Margaret Hartwell Chen visited often, helping to establish the Whispering Pines Memorial Center on the site where her grandfather and 149 others had been murdered. The center would ensure that the victims' names and stories would never be forgotten again. Blackstone Industries had been dissolved, its executives facing life sentences, its assets redistributed to victim compensation funds. But more importantly, Isabella had learned that even the most powerful dragons could be defeated when ordinary people chose courage over comfort. As she watched her daughter play in the meadow where genocide had once been hidden, Isabella understood that their desperate gamble for shelter had become something far more valuable, proof that the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would eventually surface. Some stories end with treasure. This one ended with justice. And in the mountains of Wyoming, where winter winds still whispered through the pines, the voices of the disappeared families finally found peace, carried on the breath of a 9-year-old girl whose mother had chosen to fight dragons rather than surrender to them. The cabin that had nearly killed them had instead saved them all.